The morning started like any other. The sun had barely peeked over the rooftops, casting a soft golden light on the quiet street. Birds chirped lazily and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. It was the kind of morning that made people feel calm, almost peaceful, except that nothing about this morning was going to stay peaceful for long. Not for the narrator, at least. The narrator had been living in their small, cozy house for a few years now. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, and they liked it that way. Every corner of the house had memories. The small kitchen where countless late-night snacks had been made. The living room where friends had laughed until their cheeks hurt, and the backyard where summer evenings had been spent with a cup of tea, staring at the sunset. It was home, and they had always felt safe here. But lately, that sense of peace had been slipping away, and it had everything to do with the neighbor, Karen. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her, or at least they thought they did. She had that kind of personality that demanded attention without ever asking for it. Loud, opinionated, and impossible to ignore, Karen had a way of inserting herself into situations where she didn't belong. At first, it was little things, commenting on the way the narrator trimmed their hedges, criticizing the color of the curtains, or loudly complaining about noise that wasn't even there. The narrator had tried to brush it off, thinking it was easier to ignore her than to argue. But ignoring Karen had only seemed to encourage her. The conflict began quietly, like a small crack in a wall. One evening, after a long day of work, the narrator went to do the dishes and noticed something strange. The water in the kitchen sink wasn't draining. At first they thought it was a simple clog, something normal, but as they tried to rinse a plate, the water only rose higher and soon it was spilling over the edges. Panic set in. They grabbed a bucket trying to contain the mess, but it was already too late. A puddle had formed on the floor, soaking the rug and creeping toward the cabinets. It didn't take long for suspicion to creep in. The narrator remembered the little smile on Karen's face last week when she had complained about the narrator leaving food scraps in the sink. At the time, it had seemed harmless, almost silly. But now, standing in a rapidly growing puddle of dirty water, the narrator couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. It was clear to them that Karen had done this on purpose. The next morning, the narrator tried to confront her. Standing at the edge of her driveway, they called out politely, hoping to get an explanation. Karen appeared at her window, arms crossed with that familiar smug expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, pretending not to know. "My drain is clogged," the narrator said, "and I have a feeling you had something to do with it." Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, that's terrible. I would never. Maybe it just happened." Her tone was sharp, but there was no real apology in it. It was just the kind of dismissive shrug that made the narrator's blood boil. Back in their kitchen, the narrator tried to fix the sink themselves. They grabbed a plunger and started working, but it was no use. The clog was stubborn, almost as if someone had planned it that way. The frustration built with every failed attempt, and with each passing hour the anger grew. They had never been a vengeful person, but the combination of exhaustion, stress, and the thought of Karen's smug face made it hard to think rationally. While trying to unclog the drain, the narrator's mind wandered to past incidents with Karen. There was the time she had spread rumors about them in the neighborhood, the time she had called the homeowners association over a minor landscaping issue, and the countless moments when she had made snide remarks just to provoke a reaction. Each memory was like a small spark, feeding a fire that had been slowly growing for months. By late afternoon, the narrator realized that calling a plumber might be the only solution. But even that came with its own frustrations. The plumber they contacted could only come in 2 days, and in the meantime, water was still pooling on the kitchen floor. Every time the narrator tried to wash a dish or fill a glass, they had to deal with the mess. They felt trapped, helpless, and more than a little angry. It wasn't just the physical mess that bothered them, it was the principle. Karen had crossed a line, and the narrator couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. They weren't sure what yet, but they knew that ignoring it was no longer an option. Sitting at the kitchen table, dripping wet from trying to mop up water, the narrator began to plan. They didn't want to stoop to Karen's level, not really, but at the same time, the desire for justice or revenge was hard to ignore. Over the next few hours, they observed Karen more closely than ever. From their kitchen window, they could see her going about her day, laughing with friends on the porch, completely unaware, or pretending to be unaware, of the chaos she had caused. It was infuriating. The narrator made a mental note of her routines, her comings and goings, and even the small details that might be important if they ever decided to respond in kind. Neighbors began to notice the tension too. A few walked by and asked if everything was okay. The narrator smiled politely and assured them it was just a plumbing issue. But inside they were already rehearsing scenarios. What if Karen did something even worse? What could they do to protect themselves while also making it clear that her behavior was unacceptable? Even at night, the thoughts didn't stop. The narrator lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the kitchen flooded beyond repair, imagining Karen realizing the consequences of her actions, imagining a world where justice was served. Some of the thoughts were rational, some impulsive, but all of them were fueled by frustration and the sense of violation. Their home, their safe space, had been compromised and they couldn't ignore it. By the time morning came again, the narrator had made a decision. They wouldn't let Karen get away with this. Not this time. They didn't have a full plan yet, but the seed of revenge had been planted. It was a small, almost imperceptible seed, but it was there and it was growing. They went about their day pretending to be normal, but every action, every glance toward Karen's house reminded them of what had happened. And so, the story began, not with an act of revenge, but with a realization. Some people couldn't be reasoned with, and sometimes standing by and being polite wasn't enough. The narrator knew that the next chapter of their life would be shaped by what they decided to do next. They didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but one thing was certain. Karen had crossed a line, and the narrator wasn't going to forget it. The kitchen sink remained clogged, a constant reminder of the injustice, a symbol of the simmering tension between neighbors. The water still pooled stubbornly, and every time the narrator saw it, they felt a mix of anger, frustration, and determination. It wasn't just about the water. It was about respect, fairness, and standing up for oneself. Little did the narrator know this was just the beginning. The events that followed would test patience, creativity, and the limits of neighborly tolerance. But for now they focused on one thing: the injustice of a clogged drain, the audacity of a neighbor, and the small, burning thought that sometimes the only way to respond to someone like Karen was to fight back in a way she would never see coming. The next few days were some of the most frustrating the narrator had ever experienced. Every time they turned on the kitchen tap, the water rose slowly, almost mockingly, reminding them of Karen's audacity. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. It had become a constant source of stress, gnawing at the edges of every task they tried to do. Washing dishes, rinsing vegetables, even filling a glass of water had turned into a battle. The plumber finally arrived, and the narrator's hope rose for a brief moment. But after poking around the pipes, the plumber frowned. "This is unusual," he said, shaking his head. "It looks like someone deliberately caused this. I can fix it, but it's going to take some time." His words confirmed what the narrator had suspected all along. Karen hadn't just been careless, she had done this on purpose. When the plumber left, the narrator sat in the kitchen, exhausted and furious. They tried to calm themselves, telling themselves it wasn't worth losing sleep over, but the anger wouldn't fade. It bubbled beneath the surface, making even simple interactions with neighbors feel tense. Every time they saw Karen through her window or walking past the house, that smug smile made their blood boil. To cope, the narrator tried to distract themselves. They started going for walks around the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would help. But even then, it was impossible to ignore Karen. She seemed to be everywhere, waving at other neighbors, chatting, laughing, completely unbothered by the chaos she had caused. It felt like she was taunting them, daring them to react. The narrator clenched their fists and walked faster, pretending not to notice, but inside, the frustration grew heavier. As the days passed, small acts of retaliation crept into the narrator's mind. Nothing extreme, just little ways to get back at Karen without crossing the line. They considered harmless pranks, like leaving her mailbox slightly open so the papers would spill, or putting a small temporary sticker on her door. These thoughts made them feel better temporarily, but they quickly realized that nothing would satisfy the deep sense of injustice they felt. The drain incident wasn't minor. It had invaded their home, their safe space, and it deserved more than a small, harmless prank. The narrator started paying closer attention to Karen's routines. They noticed when she left for work, when she took her afternoon walks, and when she entertained visitors. Every detail seemed important. They even noted how she kept her backyard door unlocked sometimes, or how she would leave her windows open on certain mornings. The narrator didn't act on these observations yet, but they stored the information carefully as if preparing for something bigger. Meanwhile, the clogged drain continued to cause problems. Water pooled on the kitchen floor, making chores frustrating and time-consuming. The narrator became increasingly careful, tipping cups slowly, wiping up spills immediately, and avoiding using the sink whenever possible. Even brushing their teeth became a small challenge, as they had to be careful not to let water overflow. Each day the annoyance compounded, and with it, the feeling of being disrespected and trapped. One evening, after yet another day of frustrating plumbing issues, the narrator decided to confront Karen again. This time they wanted more than an apology. They wanted acknowledgement, recognition of what she had done. They walked up to her porch as she watered her plants, trying to stay calm. "Karen," they said, keeping their voice steady, "I know you clogged my drain. I don't understand why you would do that. It caused a lot of damage and stress." Karen looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but it was gone almost immediately. She smiled, faintly condescending, and said, "I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe it's just bad luck." The narrator's jaw tightened. "Bad luck doesn't explain the timing, Karen. You've been causing trouble in little ways for a while now. This isn't just an accident." Karen shrugged, still maintaining her confident air. "Maybe you're overreacting. It's just a drain. Things happen." The narrator felt their frustration spike. It wasn't the damage, they could handle that, but it was the lack of accountability, the way Karen brushed it off as if it were nothing. That casual dismissal, that refusal to take responsibility, was almost worse than the act itself. The narrator walked away, fists clenched, the thought of revenge simmering stronger than ever. That night, the narrator lay awake, thinking about possibilities. How could they make Karen understand the consequences of her actions? How could they respond in a way that would finally make her realize the seriousness of what she had done? Every scenario played out in their mind, some sensible, some impulsive, but all fueled by the anger and frustration that had been building for days. The next morning, they tried to focus on normal life, but even small interactions felt tense. Grocery shopping became a mental exercise in patience as they imagined Karen watching them or judging their choices. Even at work, their thoughts kept drifting back to the drain, to the water pooling on their kitchen floor, to the sense that they had been wronged and dismissed. Neighbors began to notice the tension too. A few came by to ask if everything was okay, and the narrator forced smiles and reassurances. "Just a plumbing issue," they said, hoping that would be enough to satisfy the curious. But inside, the narrator was far from satisfied. The idea of simply letting Karen get away with it became harder and harder to accept. As the days went on, the narrator experimented with small acts of retaliation. They weren't dramatic, just little things that hinted they were aware of Karen's behavior. A harmless note left on her doorstep, a subtle rearrangement of garden ornaments, a small prank that caused mild confusion. These acts were satisfying in a minor way, a way to regain some sense of control, but they didn't provide the satisfaction the narrator truly sought. With each day, the narrator's mind became more focused on strategy. They thought about timing, about patterns, about how to respond in a way that would be clever, undeniable, and unforgettable. They considered what tools or knowledge they would need, what mistakes to avoid, and how to ensure they weren't caught. The narrator didn't want to act impulsively. They wanted to plan, to execute something that would teach Karen a lesson she wouldn't forget. One afternoon, while sitting at the kitchen table, the narrator looked at the stubborn water still trapped in the sink. They ran their fingers along the edge of the countertop, thinking about all the times they had tried to remain polite, all the times they had ignored Karen's petty interference, and all the times she had smiled smugly as if nothing mattered. The anger, the frustration, the desire for justice, it all came together in a single thought. Something had to change. The narrator knew that their next steps would require patience and careful observation. They began keeping a small notebook, recording details about Karen's movements, the times she left and returned, when she had visitors, and even how she interacted with the neighborhood. Each entry was factual, almost clinical, but underneath the surface was the growing determination that fueled their thoughts. This was no longer about a clogged drain, it was about respect, accountability, and finally taking control of a situation that had been unfairly dominated by Karen. Even during ordinary moments, the narrator's mind was active. Cooking, cleaning, and running errands became exercises in observation. Every glance out the window, every encounter with neighbors, every small sound in the neighborhood became a clue, a potential insight into how Karen lived her daily life. The narrator wasn't just planning revenge, they were gathering knowledge, preparing for a moment when they could respond in a way that would be precise, clever, and unforgettable. By the end of the week, the narrator realized that simple pranks or complaints would no longer suffice. Karen had shown that she didn't care about rules, respect, or fairness. It was clear that only a carefully planned, bold action would get through to her. The narrator didn't rush. They knew that patience would be essential. They would wait for the right moment, observe carefully, and ensure that when they acted, it would be undeniable. And so, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. The kitchen sink remained clogged, small pranks were tried and abandoned, and Karen continued her oblivious or intentionally dismissive behavior. But underneath it all, the narrator's determination grew stronger. Each day, each observation, each minor frustration fed the idea that something bigger was coming. By the time night fell again, the narrator lay in bed thinking about possibilities. They imagined the perfect scenario, carefully calculated and executed. They didn't want to be reckless. They wanted to be clever, to turn the tables in a way that Karen would never expect. The thought was both exciting and terrifying, but the narrator knew one thing for sure: things couldn't stay the same. Karen had started this, and it was time for her to see the consequences. The narrator woke early with a tight feeling in their chest. The clogged sink had become a low hum in their life, always there, always nagging. Over the past week, they had recorded Karen's comings and goings in a small notebook. It felt strange to plan anything, but the notebook had become a steady, practical thing they could hold when the anger felt too big. They traced the pen marks with their thumb and tried to breathe slowly. They did not want to be cruel. They did not want to be the kind of person who hurt others for sport. But they also did not want to be the kind of person who allowed someone to invade their home and walk away without consequence. The two ideas sat side by side in their head, fairness and restraint, and both felt heavy. The narrator started with small, careful decisions. If they were going to act, it would be smart and deliberate, not reckless. They read online about non-destructive ways to make a point: public exposure, calling the homeowners association, documenting damage for insurance, and involving neutral witnesses. They made a list of paths they could take and circled the ones that would not endanger anyone or break the law. The list was long and practical. The voice inside that wanted immediate revenge felt ignored for once. Still, old instincts were hard to silence. At night, the narrator imagined confrontations. They pictured Karen standing in wet shoes, looking shocked and trying to explain. The image both satisfied and terrified them. They would not act from a place of pure anger. They would create a plan that made Karen feel the same vulnerability the narrator had felt when their home was violated, but without danger or damage beyond proof of wrongdoing. They started by gathering facts. The plumber's notes were important. He had said the clog looked deliberate. The narrator called back to the company and asked for a fuller report. The office emailed a short write-up, noting small objects found where the pipe had been blocked. The narrator printed the report and kept it in a folder. They also photographed the kitchen, making sure to capture watermarks, warped cabinet edges, and the rug that had been ruined by the spill. The images were ordinary and plain, but they told a clearer story than any argument could. Next, the narrator reached out quietly to two neighbors who had always been friendly. One was the elderly man across the street who tended his roses with a careful hand. The other was the young woman who ran her own bakery and always brought extra cookies when she was feeling generous. The narrator did not accuse anyone. They simply said they were dealing with a troubling situation and wanted to know if either neighbor had seen anything unusual. The replies were sympathetic but vague. People did not like getting involved. Still, both neighbors agreed to keep an eye out and to tell the narrator if they noticed anything odd. It was small, but it felt like support. As days passed, the narrator began to watch Karen more. Observing felt different from spying. It felt like completing a jigsaw puzzle, one piece at a time. Every afternoon, Karen took a specific route for her walk. She left for work at almost exactly the same time each morning. She liked to leave a back window open on warm days. These small details would matter if the narrator needed to show a pattern. The narrator also thought about the social angle. Karen loved being seen as perfect in the neighborhood, always polite in public, always first to volunteer for community events. That image was part of her power. If people learned that she had deliberately sabotaged someone's home, that carefully curated picture might crack. The narrator did not want to humiliate her. They wanted accountability. They wanted neighbors to understand that actions have consequences. There was one practical step that felt right. File a formal complaint. The narrator collected everything, the plumber's report, the photos, dates, and notes, and wrote a clear account of what had happened. They used simple language focusing on facts. They described the day the sink filled, the notes from the plumber, and the time they had spoken to Karen. They submitted the packet to the homeowners association and to the plumber's office, asking both to keep copies. The act itself was calming. Instead of imagining elaborate revenge, they were building a paper trail. Still, paperwork often moves slowly. The narrator did not want to wait passively while the association considered the complaint. They wanted a way to nudge things forward. They decided to set a small trap, not to harm, but to create a situation that would make Karen uncomfortably aware that someone was looking. The narrator thought about showing evidence publicly, but feared that would only make neighbors pick sides. A better approach was to create a moment where Karen might learn that her actions had consequences through a private, undeniable sign. They focused on visibility. The narrator bought a small, inexpensive drain cover camera. It was a simple device meant for plumbers to check pipes, not a tool for drama. They placed it in the folder with their other evidence and read the manual late into the night. The idea was not to record private conversations or invade anyone's home. The goal was limited, to have a time-stamped visual record of any tampering that might happen to the narrator's property again. The camera felt like an insurance policy, a neutral witness who would tell the truth. With the camera ordered, the narrator shifted attention to community pressure. They wrote a short note to the neighbors, a measured message about safety and respect without naming anyone. It read in part, "Someone in our neighborhood deliberately damaged another person's home last week. If you have any information, please come forward to help keep our community safe." The narrator left copies at the mailbox, slipped one under the baker's door, and handed one to the elderly neighbor. The reactions were mixed. One person was shocked, another nodded slowly. The baker offered a slice of cake and a hug. Still, the note had seeded the idea that something unacceptable had happened and that the community should care. Weeks passed. The camera arrived and was installed discreetly under the sink, pointed at the pipe. It was not dramatic, just a small dome tucked behind the basin. The narrator checked the feed nightly, not to spy on Karen but to ensure their home was safe. The camera gave them a strange comfort, like having a friend who would quietly tell the truth. Then something unexpected happened. One evening, the narrator noticed a delivery truck parked near Karen's house. A large box was being carried to her door by two men who seemed unsure. Later, they watched from their window as Karen invited neighbors to her afternoon tea, smiling and chatting like nothing had happened. The narrator felt the old anger flare, but now it lived beside a new sensation. Nervous anticipation. The camera might show nothing at all and the narrator might be left empty-handed. Or it might show something that would change the neighborhood's view. A few nights later, the camera recorded movement where the pipe met the wall. A small shadow moved across the frame. The narrator watched the replay with a tight throat. It was not a clear image, but there was enough. A dark-gloved hand, a small tool, a movement that suggested tampering. The file was time-stamped and the narrator saved it in multiple places. They did not act immediately. They sat with the evidence, letting it settle. Now they had a choice. They could confront Karen directly, show her the footage and demand an apology. They could go to the homeowners association with the file and press for immediate action. Or they could take a different route. Use the evidence to make a point that would reach the whole neighborhood without making the narrator the center of attention. The narrator weighed each option, thinking of how to preserve their dignity while seeking justice. They chose a middle path. The narrator scheduled a meeting with the association, filled an envelope with copies of the evidence, and asked for a closed session. At the meeting, they spoke clearly and calmly, showing the short video and explaining the pattern of harassment they had documented. Faces around the table shifted. The association chair, who had always been polite to Karen, looked uncomfortable. The group agreed to investigate, to contact insurance, and to ask Karen for an explanation. The narrator felt relief, but not triumph. The point was not to win a petty victory. It was to restore a sense of balance. After the meeting, some neighbors approached with quiet apologies for not acting sooner. The elderly man brought over a basket of peaches. The baker offered to help with cleaning and with any paperwork. It was the kind of small kindness that mended frayed edges. That night, the narrator sat by the kitchen window, looking at Karen's house across the street. Karen still walked her dog, still chatted with neighbors. But now the narrator knew that the image she had painted for the neighborhood could be questioned. That knowledge made the narrator feel a little lighter. They had planned carefully, acted with restraint, and used honest tools: a plumber's report, photographs, a camera, and the community's voice. It was not dramatic. It was not cruel. It was deliberate. The narrator understood that revenge could take many forms, and sometimes the most satisfying one was quiet and just. They went to bed that night with a calmer mind, ready for whatever would come next, knowing they had used their voice to make a clear point. Actions have consequences. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, the narrator turned off the living room light and listened to the soft hum of the refrigerator. The clogged sink still needed repair work, but that no longer felt like the only problem. The bigger issue was order and respect in tea. Days passed, and the narrator continued life with quiet vigilance. They maintained routines as normal, but each glance toward Karen's house reminded them that the situation was far from resolved. The homeowners association had contacted Karen, and while she had answered with polite words, it was clear she was annoyed rather than contrite. Her behavior had not changed. She still walked past the narrator's house with a smug smile, still greeted neighbors in her usual cheery manner, as though nothing had happened. But the narrator knew the truth, and that knowledge gave them a quiet sense of power. Even with the association involved, the narrator felt restless. They had documented every step, collected evidence, and involved neighbors, yet Karen remained unshaken. The narrator realized that action might be necessary, not impulsive or malicious, but deliberate and controlled. They reflected on the last few weeks and understood that sometimes the person causing harm needs to experience a mirror of their own behavior to understand its effect. They did not want chaos. They wanted accountability. It began on an ordinary afternoon. The narrator had noticed that Karen frequently left a small back window open during warm days. From their kitchen window, they could see inside her yard and a narrow view of the window. They waited patiently, watching her leave for an afternoon walk. When Karen finally departed, the narrator moved quietly, checking that all neighbors were either out or inside, so no one would witness the following events except Karen herself. They were careful, methodical, and deliberate. The plan was simple in principle but precise in execution. The narrator had access to extra plumbing tools and a small hose. Their goal was to create a minor but unmistakable inconvenience, a reflection of what Karen had caused them. Nothing dangerous, nothing permanent, but enough to show her the effect of deliberate disruption. They worked quickly, connecting the hose, ensuring it only affected the small area of the backyard below the open window. They were aware of the risks, thinking through every possibility and preparing for the worst-case scenario, though they hoped it would not come to that. When everything was in place, the narrator stepped back and took a deep breath. The moment was tense. Their pulse was steady, but their mind was alert. They opened the water slightly, allowing it to flow gently. The trickle soon became noticeable, seeping slowly into the lower yard. The narrator watched from their vantage point, seeing the water begin to spread. They were careful to ensure it stayed contained, just enough to soak the patio area and puddle near the foundation, but not enough to risk serious damage. It was the perfect reflection, an inconvenience, a reminder of the disruption they had experienced. Minutes passed, and then the moment arrived. Karen returned earlier than expected, and the narrator froze, heart pounding. She rounded the corner and stepped into the backyard. At first she smiled, waving at a passing neighbor. Then she noticed the water. Her smile vanished, replaced by confusion and panic. She stepped closer, trying to understand what had happened, glancing up toward the window, then down at the patio, her hands on her hips. The water had pooled noticeably, the hose had been left partially visible, and the slight puddling was undeniable. Her eyes narrowed, scanning for signs of mischief or explanation. The narrator watched quietly from behind the curtains. They felt a strange combination of satisfaction and guilt. The satisfaction came from seeing Karen face a minor consequence of her own behavior. The guilt stemmed from the knowledge that while this was controlled, it was still an action taken against another person's property. They reminded themselves repeatedly, no one was hurt, nothing was permanently damaged, and the goal was not humiliation but reflection. Karen, flustered and muttering, attempted to block the flow of water, scooping at it with her hands and moving a small garden chair to stop the puddles. Her frustration was palpable, and the narrator felt the tension in the air like static. It was precisely the emotional jolt they had imagined, a mirror of the helplessness they themselves had felt weeks earlier when the sink overflowed. Then she noticed the hose, coiled awkwardly near the edge of the patio. Her gaze sharpened, scanning for any indication of who might have done this. She looked directly toward the narrator's house, suspicion flickering across her face. The narrator stayed behind the window, breathing slowly, careful not to give themselves away. They knew that confrontation was risky, but part of them wanted Karen to feel accountable, even if only for a moment. Karen ran inside to fetch a towel, then returned to mop up the small flood. The narrator noticed the effort, the care she took, and the muttered curses under her breath. Every movement, every exasperated gesture, made the narrator realize how much energy Karen invested in maintaining appearances while ignoring the consequences of her actions. For the narrator, this observation was more than satisfaction. It was understanding. Sometimes people only learned lessons through experience. By the time the water stopped seeping, Karen was exhausted and flustered, standing amid small puddles and scattered patio furniture. She scanned the yard again, then looked toward the narrator's house once more, suspicion etched into her expression. For the first time, her usual confident demeanor faltered. She could not place blame on accident. She could not explain the timing, and for a moment, she realized that someone was paying attention, that her own actions had consequences she had not accounted for. The narrator sat back in their chair, letting out a long breath. They did not cheer, they did not celebrate. They simply observed the result of their controlled intervention. Karen was unsettled, aware, and perhaps even reflective. The narrator's heart still thumped, not from triumph, but from the awareness that they had finally created a small shift in perception, a mirror to show Karen what it felt like to have one's home invaded and disrupted. Neighbors noticed the subtle disturbance too. Some glanced out their windows, curious about the activity in Karen's yard. One neighbor walked past the narrator's house, nodding politely, unaware of the full story. The narrator remained quiet, observing, not explaining. They did not need recognition for their action. The change had already occurred where it mattered most, in Karen's immediate awareness. That evening, Karen was quieter than usual. She avoided eye contact when passing the narrator's house and spent time indoors with the curtains drawn. The narrator did not gloat. Instead, they reflected on the situation, thinking about how easily small actions could ripple into understanding. The flood had been controlled, thoughtful, a small, deliberate mirror of what had been done to them. It was a moment of subtle justice, not spectacle. The following day, the narrator checked the backyard. The puddles had dried, the soil absorbed the water, and the minor mess had been cleared. Karen had returned to her routines, but something had shifted. Her previous confidence, her ease in dismissing other people's feelings, had dimmed slightly. The narrator could see it in the small gestures, slower movements, careful steps, more hesitancy when speaking to neighbors. It was not dramatic, but it was meaningful. The mirror had worked. Later that week, the Homeowners Association contacted both parties to discuss the situation. The narrator provided the full record of their observations, documentation, and the plumber's notes. Karen spoke as if trying to regain composure, but her words lacked the certainty they once had. The association reminded both parties of responsibilities, rules, and neighborly conduct. It was official, formal, and necessary. The narrator felt satisfaction in knowing they had done everything within reason, legally and carefully, to bring awareness to the situation. Even at home, the narrator reflected on what had happened. They did not feel guilty for their measured action, yet they were aware of the thin line between justice and retaliation. They realized that being deliberate, thoughtful, and controlled had allowed them to assert themselves without crossing boundaries that could cause real harm or regret. It was a lesson in patience, planning, and the power of reflection. Neighbors gradually noticed that Karen seemed quieter, more cautious, less sure of herself in her interactions. The subtle shift was enough to remind the narrator that accountability could exist without chaos. They had created a situation that reflected truth without cruelty, a moment where cause and effect aligned. By the end of the week, life returned to its usual rhythms. The narrator's kitchen sink was repaired, the floor dried and cleaned, and their sense of safety restored. Karen remained a presence across the street, but the small flood had changed the dynamics. Respect, awareness, and consequence had quietly taken root. The narrator continued observing, still cautious, still mindful, but calmer, knowing they had acted thoughtfully and effectively. In the quiet of the evening, the narrator sat at the window sipping tea, watching the soft glow of the streetlights. The world was peaceful once again, but the lessons of recent weeks lingered. Boundaries mattered, consequences mattered, and thoughtful action could bring understanding without unnecessary harm. They felt a subtle satisfaction, knowing that the balance had shifted even if slightly, and that the next chapters would unfold with a clearer sense of fairness and control.